Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be working on a pair of hand-forged dividers. This design is usually referred to as firm joint dividers because the settings are maintained by the clamping pressure provided by the two large washers that hold the legs together. This design maintains the classic look, but the two legs are just assembled with a simple lap joist, so they're very easy to put together and to adjust. I'm going to start by forging out the two washers that are used to rivet the two sides together. With firm joint dividers, especially with older examples, these two washers tended to be quite large, and that's because the washer and the rivet assembly has to work as a unit to act as a clamp to give just enough resistance to the legs so that you can move them but still maintain the settings. So that whole unit has to be very rigid once it's assembled. So that's why we're using extra thick washers, and the rivet in the center is actually larger than you normally would use for a regular set of dividers. These washers can be shaped any number of ways. You can cut them out of a heavy bar and file or grind them to shape. If you have a metal cutting hole saw that's the right size, you can just saw them out of the bar. Of course, if you have a lathe, you can turn them and part them off. There's any ways of approaching this, but I'm going to be showing you how to forge them out. So here's the train of thought I used for developing this method of making the washers. I know that I need a little bit more metal than this to make the washer, and I also know that I need some way of handling this in the fire and while I'm forging it into a washer. So what I'm going to be demonstrating here is how I weld this little slug of metal to a piece of flat bar, and then I shape the washer on the end of that flat bar. I'm using 1/4 by 3/4 flat bar as the handle, but really anything will do. And then you just follow pretty standard hole punching procedures to put a hole at the end of the bar to hold a 1/2 inch round. I'm being careful to undersize this hole just enough so that I will need to drive the 1/2 inch rod in place. For the first heat, I'm just upsetting the 1/2 inch bar slightly into a mushroom shape. There's no welding going on here. This is the first welding heat, and in the next couple of welding heats, I'm just going to further refine that dome shape that I need to the rivet. So now I have a washer on a piece of flat bar that I can use to clamp in the vise and do all of the shaping that I need to do to the washer before I cut it off of the bar. And because I'm going to be able to forge it to shape, I'm going to be able to get the shape 90% there before I even need to start doing any filing or grinding. The legs are made from 1/2 inch square bar, and I start by creating an offset that's 2 inches in from the end. This offset creates the transition that I need to go from the original 1/2 inch square bar down to a 1/4 by 1/2 flat bar. Next, I rotate the bar 90 degrees counterclockwise, and I forge another offset that will start defining the upper hinge area of the leg. In the next couple of heats, I'm going to be using the cross peen to further shape this area until I get the width that I need. And then I'll use a couple of heats to rough in the lower portion of the leg. Now that the rough forging is done, I need to refine the shape of this overlap area so that I can get the two pieces to fit together fairly closely. I'm going to start by sharpening up that angle at the offset, and then I'm going to move from there and remove the radius that I have from the second offset. Finally, I'm going to roughly cut in the angle that I need to match with the other offset on the other leg. Now, believe it or not, none of this stuff has to be very precise. You don't really have to go crazy about the angles or everything matching up. As long as they're close enough to fit together, we're going to be able to drive them together when we fit them in the fire in the next heat. To start the process, I'm going to heat up only one leg, and then I'm going to assemble the two pieces together and drive the hot leg onto the cold leg. So basically what I'm doing is I'm using one leg of the dividers as a die to shape the other leg. So you can see how it doesn't really matter what the angles were. They're going to hammer together and they're going to be pretty seamless when you're done. Now that the two legs of the dividers basically match each other, I can heat the whole thing up as a unit and further refine the shape and the fit. Now that all the rough forging is done, I can go ahead and start defining the actual shape of the dividers. Here I'm just following a pencil line drawn onto some green painter's tape as a rough guide to what I need to get rid of. Now that the leg blanks are filed to shape, I'm going to be able to clamp the washer to the leg blank in the vise and use the leg blank as a template to file the washer to shape. But I'm still not cutting the washer off the bar yet because I still need to be able to clamp it in the drill press vise while I'm drilling the rivet hole. Before we can assemble the dividers, we have to do a little bit of prep work. It's pretty minimal, but it still has to be done. The first thing I need to do is quickly file the inside face to make sure that it's basically flat. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you just want to make sure that there aren't any real peaks and valleys. The only thing that's really critical is the actual hinge area, the circular area where the washer actually sits. It has to be the same thickness through that whole area. In other words, it can't be wedge-shaped. If this area isn't basically flat with both faces roughly parallel to each other, you're going to be creating a wedging action and prying up on the washers as you're moving the legs around. So you want to minimize that as much as possible. Again, it doesn't have to be a machined surface, but it has to be basically flat rather than wedge-shaped. I'm using a pair of spring calipers to just roughly test the thickness. I have them set for the thinnest area of this hinge area, and then I'm just dragging them around to see where they get hung up. And then where they're getting hung up is obviously a high spot, so I'm filing that down until I get the same resistance all through that hinge area. Again, it doesn't have to be a machined surface, but you want to get it as close as you can, because if you leave these pieces wedge-shaped, you're going to start prying up against the washers as you're moving the legs around, and you're going to get tight and loose areas that are going to make the dividers really hard to adjust. So now we're finally ready to put this thing together. I'm using a 1/4-inch round bar as the rivet. I would have preferred to have something a little bit heavier like 5/16, but I didn't have anything around. A 1/4 inch will be fine, but I certainly wouldn't go any thinner than that. The washers are counterbored slightly so that when I hammer in the rivet head, it'll sit below the surface of the top of the washer. You'll notice that I left the rough edges of the washers towards the outside, and I haven't finished them yet because I'm going to be riveting them in place, and I'm going to actually use the dividers to hold them in the vise while I'm trimming the outside edges. If everything was done right, it should be fairly easy to pry the legs of the dividers apart. At this point, just work them back and forth slowly. If they feel tight and loose, don't worry about that right now. Just keep working them back and forth until you feel the high areas are being worn away. At that point, you can tighten up the rivet slightly and then throw it back in the fire and repeat the process. Just keep repeating this process until the resistance feels even right through the entire range of motion. Once you have the hinge area tuned up, you can take a couple of heats and work your way down to the other end of the dividers and get everything lined up there. From here, you can take it back to the vise to finish shaping those washers and to clean up any of the outside edges that need refining. To finish tuning up the hinge area, you continue working the legs of the dividers open and closed until they start to loosen up slightly, and then again you tighten up the rivet, oil them up, work them back and forth until you just start feeling that they're consistent and even. It may take a few tries to do that, but it will happen.